Hey, deserving listeners, a lot of you have been asking me to watch this video put out by Tiff. So let's watch. My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. And keep in mind that everything I say in reaction to this is off the top of my head and also speculative often. I can't really know the situation. So let's watch.
Until you're out of it. And let's be clear, both parties of a relationship can be toxic. But research has shown over and over again that in majority of cases, there always only tends to be one abuser in the relationship that dominates power and control.
Okay, so let me talk about mutual abuse. And I want to say from the outset that the way that it looked to me was, well, the way I would phrase it is, given the way that the show is edited and given the way that the cast members presented on the show, and there wasn't that much data to inform us as to what was actually happening behind the scenes with Tiff and Mildred. But given the data, the top hypothesis I would have, if I was asked to assess the couple, was that Mildred was the primary abuser, and that Tiff might occasionally use words in an abusive manner, but the overall coercion, the overall sense of unsafety, the overall rigidity was being perpetrated by Mildred. I don't know the degree of that. We couldn't really tell. We didn't hear a lot of reports of violence beyond that. Maybe Tiff will get into it here. I'm guessing that they will. I would suspect that given my experience with treating perpetrators, I treated perpetrators who were convicted of intimate partner violence, domestic violence, and were forced into my program. I worked alongside domestic violence treatment professionals as the therapist, the psychology-oriented individual, and would work with the perpetrators in a year-long program that was designed to essentially deprogram them from the mindset and the personality that will be the main factor behind future intimate partner violence acts. People who commit intimate partner violence, they have personality issues, they have attachment issues, they have modeling issues, meaning that violence was often modeled to them. They often have misogynistic and sexist attitudes when it comes to male perpetrators in heterosexual relationships. So I worked with them, I worked with the families, I worked with the victims. Of course, in my private practice, I have treated many victims and perpetrators in my practice. So my point is that the way that Mildred was talking, the way that she was acting, the way that she would overpower and shut down Tiff looked like there might be a bigger issue there. We can't really tell. A lot of people on the internet were sure of their speculations, and even after Tiff gives us more information, it's just hard to know. As a person who actually works ground level with individuals, I can tell you that I have been wrong, even though I have a lot of data. I have people telling me data from several different angles. I might talk to the Mildred, I might talk to the Tiff, I might talk to the kids, I might talk to the neighbors, I might talk to other professionals involved with the family, and have a pretty clear picture, seemingly, and will draw some conclusions only later to find out that I was completely wrong because I wasn't being told this detail or I was biased about this detail. It's just one of those things. We like to feel like we can figure things out. It's really hard for us humans to deal with uncertainty, and so we just have to take a deep breath and understand that we might not ever know what really happened here. That doesn't mean that we disbelieve Tiff or Mildred for that matter, but it does mean that we just have to be careful about the conclusions that we draw about that sort of thing. But like I said, the way that it looked like Tiff was being victimized as a pattern, especially at the reunion as Tiff and Mildred were escalating. Mildred became almost more calm in her approach and in her bulldozing. And at some point she's like, "Shut up, I don't like the sound of your voice." That's a huge tick in the column of that Mildred is the aggressor and the perpetrator. And also Tiff, as it was escalating, started to have more of a fight or flight reaction seemingly in their body. They ran off, the crying outside, the dysregulation of emotion. So now let's get to the topic of mutual abuse. There are two main topics we need to hit on, and there's a lot of discussion here. There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of research. But to talk about the first topic is that perpetrators will claim that it's mutual. When they are caught or they're found out to engage in violence or verbal abuse, emotional abuse, or financial abuse, these kinds of things, then and they can't wiggle their way out of it, they will often resort to claiming that, well, we both do those. We're both violent. Last week, she hit me, or last week, he called me a bunch of names, that kind of thing. And perpetrators will use this as a smokescreen, claiming that, look, we both do those things. Yeah, we have difficulties in our relationship that we both need to work on, instead of the perpetrator admitting that they have a problem. Now, sometimes perpetrators, because of their personality issues and their distortions, they literally don't think of themselves as a perpetrator. So that's another thing. But anyway, some perpetrators will throw up that smokescreen and say, hey, it's mutual. And they're not lying when they say that the person they're victimizing will be violent sometimes, will call them names sometimes. Sometimes the perpetrator in front of other people will manipulate the situation and push the victim into having a reaction like that so that they can use that against them as a way of more control over the victim. And so when you hear perpetrators claiming mutual abuse, there's a problem with that, obviously, and the victims are further victimized if anyone believes the perpetrator in that it is mutual. Okay. So when we learned about that, and when society started to learn about that claim from perpetrators that they will claim mutual abuse when it isn't really happening, the temptation is to claim that mutual abuse does not exist at all. But that is simply not the case according to research, and not the case according to my anecdotal experience. But how do we define it? So in the research, they have a lot of different terms on a lot of different definitions. And the problem is, on a number of levels. One is we're almost always relying on self-report. We're asking the individuals, we're asking Tiff, we're asking Mildred, were you abused? Did you abuse? Were you violent? Was someone violent with you? Did you feel unsafe? Did you make someone feel unsafe? Were there police reports? This kind of thing. So it's hard to gather the data because some people don't tell the truth, or they don't remember things, or they don't feel entitled. Victims often are afraid to tell the truth. Also, how do you define abuse exactly? As a common example, a lot of couples will call each other names sometimes. Maybe not extreme names, but they might say, oh my God, you're such a jerk. Okay, well, that's a name. Is that abusive? Was that person being abusive in that moment? Where do you draw the line? So how do you define it? Do we look at the behavior? Do we look at and ask the victim how they felt when they were being treated that way? Because you could potentially be called a lot of names by your partner and not really feel unsafe. You're just like, well, they're having a meltdown, and yes, the behavior is abusive, but I don't feel abused. Okay, so how do you figure that out? How do you define it? Does the unsafe victim know that they're unsafe? Because a lot of unsafe victims will have been gaslit by their partner, maybe even by their family beforehand, such that they don't even know what they feel. They don't feel entitled to those feelings. So how do we gather the data? How do we define it? But the gist of it, when you look at thousands of research papers from various different angles, the way that it looks is that there are a number of couples where at first glance, it's hard to tell who the victim is and who the perpetrator is. Meaning that when you observe or you hear reports, you hear violence going both ways, and you hear verbal abuse and emotional abuse going both ways. Which one is more, which one is less? Hard to gauge, because you could have a severe one-time event that happens one time a year that sufficiently will victimize the victim for the rest of the year, because the victim is in constant fear of that happening again. Or you can abuse the victim every day to a lesser extent. Plus, what is abusive, what is not? We've already been over that. So at first glance, a lot of couples where there is abuse clearly happening, it seems to be going both directions to some degree. Having said that, there are many couples where it's not. There are many couples where the perpetrator will claim it's happening when it never did. There's also couples where neither one of them will claim it goes both ways, where everyone agrees the perpetrator is the only one doing it. But there are some couples where they will report it going both ways. For a majority of those cases, there is a perpetrator and there is a victim. When you actually look at the pattern, the way it is experienced, how intense it is, then you clearly see that although there are abusive behaviors going both directions, one person is clearly dominating the other person. And the victim occasionally will fight back or occasionally will, stoop to the level of the abuser and call names or whatever. So in those situations, again, we're still looking at a majority of those cases, one person is the perpetrator. There is a subset, though, of bidirectional intimate partner violence couples where it is found after a lot of investigation that both are perpetrators and both are victims. Professionals that know what they're doing are very hesitant to land on that conceptualization. It's a conceptualization of last resort because of the risk of categorizing a couple like that when there is a clear perpetrator and a victim. There's a lot of damage that you can do as a professional if you're like, yeah, it's going both ways. You're really taking a huge risk when you make that conclusion for the victim, because if you label the victim as a perpetrator, then the abuse might be prolonged much longer than it needs to be, right? In order for safety, because the primary thing when professionals are first in contact with a couple with intimate partner violence is getting the victim safe, getting the victim to a place where they can be protected from the abuse. Then you could start working on all the other things. And if you label the perpetrator, then that's going to set that back potentially. So it's a conceptualization of last resort for that reason, but it is a conceptualization, and I've seen it before. I can never really know for sure, of course, but after a lot of time assessing and hearing stories and hearing both of them tell me their experience one-on-one. You have to make sure you talk with each person alone, have a good relationship. That for some couples, because of their upbringing, probably they learned a lot of abuse growing up. It's how they deal with being upset at their partner. When their partner hurts their feelings or concerns them, then they have a very quick emotional reaction of extreme pain and fear, and then extreme anger and control. And they will alternate and they will both perpetrate. And in those moments, and it depends on the situation, but when one of the partner is perpetrating, the victim actually feels like a victim. They feel unsafe. They feel terrified. They're worried of doing the wrong things. They're walking on eggshells. That might last for an hour. It might last for a couple weeks until things stabilize again. And then a trigger happens to the victim. And because of the way they were raised, then they go after. And now the other person is now being victimized. In these scenarios, the victimization is usually, in my anecdotal experience, not as severe because of it being more equal, I suppose. Also, when you have a clear perpetrator in the classic perpetration sense, it is so prolonged and so all-encompassing that the victim loses power. They're gaslit over time. They start believing in them. They stop believing in themselves. They're cut off from their family and friends. They don't have any power in the home, in finances. They just become this slave essentially. Whereas when you have mutual abuse, there's a lot less likelihood of that happening for a victim, which makes sense, right? Now, is it a big deal when people come forward and state, even experts, that mutual abuse doesn't exist? It doesn't really matter to me. It's not a hill that I care to die on because the consequence of it isn't that severe, because there's not that many couples that are like that. And it probably does more good than bad to be more rigid about that, because, whenever you hear someone claiming mutual abuse, in all likelihood, it is a perpetrator that is throwing up a smokescreen.
On the vortex that I didn't even know it was happening in real time. And as a lot of people who have survived these kind of relationships, you can see again and again the same patterns and the same behaviors. Most of the relationship, I actually felt bad for her. I was constantly being chewed out like a fraction of what you saw on the stage, called hundreds and hundreds of names, but will always softly guilt-tripped and shamed into believing her bad behavior was my fault.
Okay, that was consistent with what we saw, what Tiff is saying there, and I tend to believe that it was a pattern in those conversations, not only with Tiff, but also with Aussie. That's another detail that we have available to us, is that it wasn't just Mildred and Tiff. It was Mildred and Aussie. It was Mildred. Mildred is the common denominator there. Mildred is the one who does those things regardless of who she is with. It's the way she reacts. It's the entitlement that she feels. It's the distortions, perhaps, that are driving her behavior, her overreactivity. And the other thing I want to mention is that Mildred told us that she went through a very, very difficult childhood. She was, I believe, abandoned by both of her parents, and then she was raised by one of her grandparents who died when Mildred was 12, I believe. And I don't know, but I have speculated that Mildred went through a lot more than even that, because typically every time that I have heard of someone being abandoned by both of their parents at that age, it is because both parents were suffering from severe addiction. And of course, addiction not only can lead to abandonment of a child because of the disorder, they become solely focused on fueling their addiction at the expense of their children, and then eventually they either voluntarily give up their kid. A lot of times the grandparents will be like, "You're not taking care of your kid, how about I take care of the kid?" Or CPS gets involved and removes the child from the home. So not only will drug addiction affect one's parenting, but it also can affect who you bring into the house, perhaps even the abuse you inflict on the child, this sort of thing. So I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if Mildred had one of the most difficult childhoods that anyone could ever have in the history of mankind. Honestly, I mean, it's a horrific childhood to endure. And so along these lines, a lot of the perpetrators that I treated had difficulties in early childhood that resulted in them having a lot of emotional dysregulation, a lot of modeling that they saw a lot of things that were severe, and for themselves, they're not as bad as their parents, and they're patting themselves on the back, and they should for that reason, but they don't realize that they're kind of in that direction. They're not as bad as their parents, so they're like, well, I should be good, right? But they don't realize that they're still out of the healthy limits of behavior. Also, for individuals like this, they have severe physical pain when they are being rejected or when there are signs of rejection. And when they feel that pain, they feel like they're being wronged, and then they come out swinging, literally. So they feel justified because of the way that it feels to them, right? So anyway, it looked like that might have been the case for Mildred. But yeah, so Tiff is describing something that it did look like that way, that Mildred was very sure in the way that she was approaching Tiff, and Tiff was trying to work with it at times, trying to be flexible, being softer, letting Mildred talk, trying to reason, and then Mildred would just keep berating.
Guilt-tripped and shamed into believing her bad behavior was my fault.
Right, so blaming Tiff for everything, never taking responsibility. Yeah, we did at least see that in the edit.
It's the victim complex. And because I didn't love her enough, or because she was always afraid of me leaving her, I felt so horrible for everything she was going through that I started to lose my own boundaries in that relationship.
Yeah, so the way the internet will frame that for Mildred is that it is a conscious choice, this narcissistic abuse that is so much identification of people on the show being narcissistic. And I just wish people would say self-centered, because that's what they're referring to, or psychopathic, which I think is also, but no one should be diagnosing from afar. Anyway, but what Tiff was talking about right there, I'm guessing what that means is that there were times when Tiff would draw a boundary, and they broke up, they said, once every 1 or 2 weeks. And it's possible that there were times when Tiff left and said, I can't do this anymore. And then Mildred would come back to Tiff and cry and say, I don't want to lose you, and you know my childhood, and you're triggering my abandonment feelings and trauma. Don't do this to me. And if you're Tiff and you have a heart and you care about Mildred, which Tiff did and maybe still does, then it's tempting to go back, right? And you feel bad, and you might feel later on that you were being guilt-tripped. So on one level, the analysis is that Mildred knew what she was doing, and she was psychopathically, or as the internet would call, covert narcissism, or I don't know. There's just all sorts of mislabeling and misuse of these terms. And they will say that Mildred did it on purpose, and it's possible. But more often than not, and I've treated perpetrators of various different types, more often than not, they are acting from a place where they feel justified based on modeling to them and also based on the way things feel to them and also based on their distortions. None of us see reality. None of us are objective observers of reality. And especially when it comes to conflict, right? And for people that have these kinds of traumas, they're much more prone to seeing things that most people would not see. So for Mildred, she could have really believed, look, Tiff is making me feel horrible. Tiff is really mean to me. And thus, I need to really make sure that Tiff understands that they can't be mean to me like that. And so I'm going to be mean back, but only temporarily. But from the outside, and if you're Tiff and you're looking at it, all you see is Mildred being mean. And you see Tiff trying to accommodate. But the way it feels to Mildred is it feels balanced, it feels fair, it feels just to them. That is usually the case. So the treatment for perpetrators is complicated, but a major portion of it is to address these distortions, to address the indoctrination they had growing up into this mindset, to address the attachment, reactivity, to address corrective experiences for them so that they feel stable and they can regulate, to address their emotional regulation problems. Anyway, so I think that Tiff is referring to that Mildred would never admit that she was wrong, would blame, and Tiff would draw a boundary, and then Mildred would open up, which would have a guilt-tripping effect on Tiff. And then over time, Tiff would slowly demote their priority of boundaries. Because you do that, you draw a boundary. The first time that it happened with Mildred, I'm guessing Tiff drew a pretty firm boundary, and then they engaged in that process. And maybe for a while, Mildred was better, but then reverts back. And then over time, Mildred gets worse, but as it gets worse, Tiff is like, well, I forgave Mildred last time, and I don't know what's happening. It can have a gaslighting effect because you don't know what's normal. You don't know what's okay. You don't know what's acceptable. And you start thinking, well, she does have a lot of these traumas, and if I care about her, I would accommodate for that, right? And every couple has its problems, and there's always fighting sometimes. So, we'll get through this, and things get better. And Mildred is reassured. You end up tricking yourself into staying in a relationship when there are no signs that things are going to get any better. It sounds like Tiff is referring to that.
For example, rather than saying to myself, I'm constantly being called names, I don't deserve this, the manipulation of a vulnerable narcissistic trait will leave one thinking, she must have gone through so much in her life. She feels the need to call me names.
Yeah, Tiff knows Mildred a billion times more than I do, but I'm just going to take a guess and say that if I were assessing Mildred, I would not identify it as narcissistic. The internet, it seems to be getting worse, honestly, this misuse of the term. If you're just going to talk about being self-centered, or if you're going to talk about self-entitlement, or even a grandiose sense of self, or someone who thinks too highly of themselves, or someone who lacks empathy, just use those phrases, because those can be associated with a lot of things, or none of the things in the DSM. And this misidentification of those traits are all indications of narcissistic personality, or even just the term narcissism, because think narcissism. Narcissus looked at himself in the pond and fell in love with his own image. So it's kind of far afield from the way it's being used today. The way it's being used today is just this term for lack of empathy and entitlement and believing your own crap or something, or just not taking other people's feelings into consideration. It's not necessarily narcissistic personality, as I've already been over. But so I'm just going to assume what Tiff is referring to is lack of empathy, lack of remorse, lack of concern, lack of consideration, that kind of thing.
And that's horrible, to be in a relationship with someone where you believe you're a bad person the entire time. And people who haven't experienced that before say, why don't you just leave? And this is where the manipulation comes into play. And so many people can nod their heads with me and say, you know what? I have been there too.
Yeah, and good for Tiff for raising awareness about victimization and perpetration of intimate partner violence. And Tiff is referring to that phenomenon where the victim will feel like they're wrong, like they're bad. They start believing that what's being said to them. And we saw an example of the interaction style that can result in that, where Mildred is very sure of herself and, at least in the edit, never backs down, never admits that she's wrong. And in the beginning, when you first start experiencing that, even if you have a very robust sense of yourself, a good sense of self-esteem, positive upbringing, a lot of attunement in your life, you spend enough time with someone, you eventually start to call into question all those things, because we have this heuristic, I think. None of us are completely sure that we're a good person. None of us are 100% sure that, generally speaking, we're good and we're usually on the right page. None of us are sure of that. At best, you're 99% sure of that. You're around someone who is 100% sure that you're wrong all the time and that there's something wrong with you and you're a bad person. We have this heuristic of, well, I'm pretty sure, but they're more sure. And they are pointing out a lot of, that's the other thing about perpetrators is, due to the way that they saw relationships when they were young, it was modeled to them, and they're highly motivated to control because they believe it's the only way for them to get any sort of attachment security. They believe it's the only way to be able to relax. We saw that with Mildred when Aussie and Mildred were starting getting into it. Mildred started resorting to that stuff, and Aussie was just gone. And you saw the floor fall out from underneath Mildred. At first, she was just like, I'm okay, everything's fine, I'm not affected by it. Then she starts criticizing Aussie. Well, Aussie could have put this laundry basket somewhere else. I mean, why is it right in front of the dresser? And starts to get a little bit more annoyed, and then has a full emotional meltdown. I think it's understandable given Mildred's history, but the way that perpetrators that present like Mildred will operate is, if they don't have someone close to them, i.e., if they're not controlling someone, then they are faced with that pain of, I'm worthless, no one will ever love me. And they fundamentally also don't believe that someone would love them for who they are. So there's a lot of reasons why they feel like their only road to happiness is to control, and then they justify it to themselves because they can't really live with themselves as an abuser, so they brainwash themselves essentially into believing that they're okay to do all those things. And so the perpetrators typically will have had a lifetime of developing skills at control. They are very good at what they do because of practice and trial and error, and they're highly motivated given the profile that I was saying earlier. Not all abusive people are like that. You have psychopathic, sadistic abusers who are just trying to control and con you because they don't care about your feelings. Those people exist, but they're rare. And they're real, and they're abusive, and they're awful. But and I've treated them before, and it's a thing, and it's intense. But for the vast majority of abusers that I've worked with, they're this other type that are generally good people on the inside, but they are so desperate, and they learned a particular coping style for that desperation, and it is victimization of other people. Doesn't make it okay. But they're very good at what they do because of trial and error. And so for you as a victim, in all likelihood, you haven't spent your whole life trying to figure out how to game a relationship. You probably come from, at the very least, a regular sort of history of relationships where you can kind of trust the other person and trust yourself. Not all the time, but most of the time, things usually work out. So you can't be expected to, no matter how well you've been raised, you can't be expected to withstand the certainty and the way in which abusers will get under your skin emotionally. They will tear you down. I've personally and professionally been around these folks, and within half a second, they can rip me to shreds. And I was raised well, but I don't have defenses against that. I don't see it coming. I generally trust people. And so when it starts to happen, it's hard. And even if you manage to deflect or center yourself or get support, some of the time it probably won't work in the long term. So what I think Tiff is referring to is that over time, Tiff actually started to believe what Tiff was being told, that Tiff was a bad person. Okay, well, let's adjourn there. I didn't realize I would have so much to say, which is ridiculous of me not to realize because I always do. So tune in next time when I continue watching, and everyone, please take care of yourself, truly, because you deserve it. You really, really do.